Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about separating the art from the artist. And let me be very clear on this. You don't have to. No one is saying that you have to. But you can separate the art from the artist if you so wish. And if you're struggling with it, here's a way that can maybe help you. Because what I'm going to say is in no way excusing the actions of the historical person that wrote something. I'm not saying this is a way to excuse those actions, but what I'm saying is a whole sequence of arguments and observations that you can take into consideration. You don't have to, and it's not going to apply in all circumstances because sometimes people do things that are incredibly egregious. Sometimes people write things that are incredibly egregious, and we can judge them for that. But we have to be careful, and we have to be careful for the following sort of reasons and rationales. And the first is the historical person that wrote a novel is not necessarily the same person that they are today, because time, the distance achieved by time, can be a very important factor. Can be, not always, but can be. The reason I say this is if you think of how you were at 5 years old, what you believed, what you liked, what you did, how you acted, and then how you were at 15 years old, what you believed, how you act, what you liked, and then at 25 years old, and then at 35, and then at 45. We change over time. Just as, when I've spoken about reading, how books, the meaning or the enjoyment or the resonance and the emotions that we get from books, even our evaluation of them, can change over time as we change as readers. So too do authors have that ability to change. They are not necessarily the same person. So when an author writes something at, say, age 25, and then 5 years later, they get married, they have kids, they convert to a religion or lose their faith in a religion. These are world shaping events for that person. It changes their worldview. And therefore, their politics could change, their socioeconomic class could change, their ideologies can change. And they're not the same person then at age 45 that they were at 25 when they wrote the book. They think differently. And if you go, oh no, but they are still the same person, if they were still the same person, the book that they wrote at 25, if they sat down now at 45 to write it, they would write exactly the same book because they're the same person. You go, no, they wouldn't. They would write it differently. It wouldn't be word for word the same text. It would be a different text because they're a different person. They would tell the story in a different way, even if the plot beats, the narrative events, even if those narrative events were exactly the same, they would articulate it a different way because their worldview has changed. Their skill may have changed. All of these different changes mean that they are actually a different person. They react in a different way. They think in a different way. Added to that, we have the biological argument. Every cell in their body is completely different now at 45 than it was at 25. No one cell is the same. They are all different. So not only have their life experiences shaped them, but physical changes have happened as well. So those are two factors about why the person that wrote the book is not necessarily the same as the person that is currently alive now. Now, you mightn't find that particularly convincing. Well, they wrote the book, they still have to be responsible for it. Yes, they are. They are legally responsible. They're still the same legal entity. But in terms of what they thought, what they believed, what they felt, what they like, what their preferences are, those things can all be radically different now than it was back then. And those changes, it doesn't have to be 20 years. Those changes, those life experiences can happen in a short space of time. If we think of tragedies that have affected our lives or really brilliant things that have affected our lives, when people have kids, that can radically change your worldview. And that can happen, believe it or not, in 9 months, that your worldview can be completely changed in 9 months because you've had a kid. You're not the same person that you were before you became a parent. Some similarities still there, some issues still there, but it can change you. And it's the can part. Doesn't always, but it's a possibility. And because it's a possibility for some, that means we have to be very, very careful about saying, oh no, but it is just the same person in all cases. You go, no, the general rule should be they aren't the same person unless we prove that they are. We would have to assume with the passage of time, and the greater the passage of time, the more likely it is that they have changed as a person. Not everyone does, but most of us do. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what appears in the book is that historical person writing as performance. And that might sound very, very strange because we don't typically think of writing as performance. But the frame of mind of writing is of telling a story to an audience. That is performance. So it is never going to be, or actually, let me rephrase, because never is a strong word to use. It is rarely going to be a true articulation of the historical person's thoughts on something because they know they are writing for a public audience. We all know that when we have conversations in private with our friends, we may phrase things differently than, say, if we were having a recorded conversation or if we were doing something like a YouTube video. We tend to try to be more articulate, more specific, more guarded in what we say because, you know, you don't want to offend people. You don't want to say the wrong thing. You don't want to upset people. You try, but, you know, we're all fallible. We make mistakes. We're not perfect beings. So when an author is writing, they are writing to an audience, and that is performance. So what goes down on the page is not necessarily a reflection of what the physical person thinks. So even if you disregard the fact that over time that person changes, what is on the page is not necessarily reflective of what that person thinks, particularly when we are dealing with fiction, because fiction is about storytelling. And therefore, what authors do is they are trying to tell a story in such a way as to elicit responses in their audience. And therefore, they can include things that they think will elicit a response. Now, the choice of that thing can be telling. It can reveal things about an author that they think that this will create that response. They think it will communicate this thing. And that gets into a whole discussion about authorial intent. But because it is a possibility, we can't assume that they do think those things. It's a possibility. So again, it's something that has to be proven in that regard. And here's an added complication to this. You've heard of ghostwriters. Ghostwriters write stuff for lots of different people. And that really complicates the notion of author, physical person, and text. Because here we have someone going, oh, here is my book, but it was written by a ghostwriter. And that ghostwriter was trying to mimic a voice that we readers would associate with this physical person. But the ghostwriter is the person that wrote the book. And here's another one that complicates things. Nom de plumes, nom de guerre, pseudonyms. Authors can write under different pseudonyms and they assume different styles and voices and positions to write under those pseudonyms. And here's another one that complicates this. Different narrators. Narrative position is not just a camera. Narrative position can be a narrator. A narrator can have a personality. A narrator can be a character in and of themselves, even if they are not visible to us, the reader. Because of that, the physical person writing as performance. So already we're one step removed. Writing as performance, so becoming author. Physical person creates a persona, the author, this person who is talking to an audience. And that author creates a narrator, a narrative position, which is not necessarily the same as the author's position, which is not necessarily the same as the physical person's position. And you can see just in that sequence how complicated this can be. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of critics and academics refer to authors. They refer to the author, or they refer to the author's surname. And they don't refer to them ever as, or usually as, their first name, unless they're talking about the physical person. But the physical person isn't usually confused with the author of the work. That there is that separation, there is this recognition that there is a persona that is author that is not necessarily the same as the physical person. The physical person might be very, very shy. The physical person might be an introvert, but then they have to do an interview to publicize their work. And so they go into author mode and they assume a persona, and they go and they give this whole interview. And then they come home and they collapse into a shivering wreck. That isn't beyond the bounds of contemplation. A lot of authors are like that. A lot of authors, one of the reasons they got into writing was because they were introverted. It was their way of expressing themselves. It was their way of creating things in the safety of their own room with a typewriter or a notepad or a laptop or a computer. They write because they wanted to tell a story. And that none of this means that we can't get glimpses of the physical person at the time that they wrote it. None of that means that we can't get glimpses of aspects of their life. But it is not a one-to-one, and it is not clear. It's through a mirror darkly. Now, another aspect of this, which again complicates things, is that we are not necessarily reading their work in the context in which it was written. Because work does not spring up out of nowhere. There is a time period in which people are writing. But when we make broad generalizations about a generation or a culture or a time period, we're ignoring the specificity of that particular person's life. And we aren't all perfect representations of the time and culture in which we live. So that complicates things. And added to that is the fact that our understanding of those time periods and cultures and situations can be flawed. So when you take all of these things together, we as reader are interpreting a text. That text was constructed from a narrative perspective. That narrative perspective was constructed by a conceit of a performer, an author, this conceit, this construct. And that was created by a physical person at a certain time and place. But we are not reading at that time and place. Therefore, we are so far removed from it. So one of the ways to keep this clear, and it's something that I try to do, is to try and keep it clear in my mind, is I refer to the author construct by the author surname. But when I'm speaking to the physical person about what they currently believe, if I'm actually speaking to them, quite often I will slip into addressing them by their first name because I'm speaking to the person. But the person is not necessarily the same as the author. Ghostwriters eloquently prove this. Science and biology tell us about the change in their cells and the fact that they are not physically the same person over time. We know from our own experience that we change as people over time. Yes, certain elements may remain constant, the whole nature versus nurture debate, but we know that we change. And so when we read a text and we go, I saw this in the text, that means this person who's still alive believes this. This is what they are like. This is the kind of person they are. Do you see how we have leapt huge chunks of this discussion And it's not to say that you cannot get glimpses of it, but when you're going to make a claim about a physical, real life person based on a work of fiction that was told by a narrator, constructed by an author to elicit responses in an audience, and that author is an element or persona of an historical person who existed at a certain time. Do you see all of those steps that remove the current physical person from that connection in the text? And again, like I said, authors don't hide all of themselves. Some of it can creep through. But when we know that ghostwriters exist, you have to be so sure that you are right. And your evidence cannot be that the thing is in the text, because inclusion is not endorsement. It has been included to elicit a response. And that inclusion has been framed by a narrative perspective. That narrative perspective was from a construction of someone performing to an audience. And that someone, author construct, was made by someone sitting in a room at a certain point in time. And if that was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the further back in time you go, the more likely it is that if you ever meet the person that created that book, they will be nothing like how they were back then, because we all grow and change over time. Anyway, just my thoughts on it. Being able to understand that, being able to think about it, it doesn't mean that you can sort of go, oh, well, I don't particularly like that author. When we talk about it informally, that's fine. But it's when we make pronouncements or judgments or ascribe beliefs, ideologies to a physical, real life person based on a work of fiction, that's when we need to be very, very careful. And you can understand why people get annoyed. You can understand why when people flippantly or facetiously or carelessly jump from this was in this text, therefore that person over there is like that. You can understand why that's upsetting. Do you want to be judged on something that you wrote in an essay that you wrote in high school when you were 14 years old? Just because you wrote it when you were 14, do you still believe it now? Maybe some of you do. But that's the thing, not everyone. So, those are just my thoughts on the matter. It actually comes in handy sometimes when we're trying to divorce the art from the artist, to be able to think this way, to be able to rationalize it this way, to be able to break it apart this way. You don't have to. No one's forcing you to. But at least you've heard my working out on it. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.